Hi and welcome back to the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. My name is Ian Humphreys and today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Ros Jones. Now, those of you that know UKMFA well will also know HEART and the work that Ros does with them. So she will be familiar to you, but for those of you that don't know Ros, well, she's a former consultant paediatrician. She took special interest in neonatal intensive care and paediatric HIV. She served on the advisory committee of the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit and on the Education and Training Committee of the RCPCH. An active member for many years in the British Perinatal Trials Group, she was also involved in reviewing NICE guidelines alongside some Time editorial. Since retiring from the NHS, she's been taking several tours teaching on safe obstetrics courses in countries in Africa. Now, she works very closely with Tony Hinton, Professor Norman Fenton, Professor Carol Sikora, and of course Gordon Hughes, John Lee, Claire Craig and Jonathan Engler. She's been part of the People's Vaccine Inquiry, the sort of knockback, if you like, of the COVID inquiry that's taking place on a governmental level, filling in all the gaps. So let's talk to Ros and get her take on the recent Module 4 of the COVID inquiry and also where we're going to go next. Welcome to another broadcast by the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, the UK's most recognised and respected organisation advocating for every individual's right to informed consent, bodily autonomy and medical choice. We are the UK's voice of ethical medicine. Well, hello Ros, thank you so much for joining us here on UKMFA TV. It's an honour to have you. We've been trying to get you on for a long time, so this is a great benefit today, if I feel, for us. And I know we've kind of met a couple of times, and we've done a little bit of work together, and we'll always be grateful for. We wanted to get you on really, especially as we've just come to the end of Module 4 of the COVID inquiry. And of course then the subsequent People's Vaccine Inquiry that you've been heavily involved in. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts, first of all, about the Module 4 itself and how that went, and did it meet, or was it what you expected, shall we say, even in a negative way?
Right, well thanks very much Ian for inviting me on. Yeah, I have to say, I think one always feared that any of these public inquiries, they're very long and expensive, and do they really just act as a bit of a whitewash to the whole thing? So I was worried, but having said that, when we were invited to provide witness statements, I suppose I became slightly encouraged that maybe they were going to be listening to some alternative voices. And 4 groups were all asked to provide witness statements, which we had to do over a year ago. You had to upload, I uploaded 250 references to the government portal. Claire Craig, I think, had 1,200 references on hers. And I even got some comeback saying something they didn't understand. Could I clarify? Could I provide extra references to explain? That was about why I said that the mRNA vaccines were a prodrug. So they were into technical stuff. And then about 6 weeks ago, I was asked if I was willing for my statement to be shared with one of their experts. I said, yes, certainly. I'd love to see her witness statement as well, which of course didn't come my way. And the expert was the professor who was looking at vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy. And I perhaps, I'm a paediatrician, and I was looking at all of this from the viewpoint really of the vaccination rollout for children. And I thought, if she even read half of what I'd written, would she actually realise that the 90% of primary school children's parents who decided not to accept this offer were actually acting with wisdom rather than with hesitancy or due to misinformation? But I mean, that was obviously very naive of me. And I think we all realised within the first, we were told about a month beforehand that we weren't needed to present our evidence orally after all. And then we were told, but thank you very much, it's been really helpful in informing our questions. But it was very obvious from within 10 minutes of the opening that that wasn't going to happen. I think you just had to listen to Hugo Keith, who's the main KC for the inquiry, in his opening statement talking about overwhelming benefit and these phrases, a complete success. And really the whole tenor of it, you got quite quickly, was that yes, they'd invited the vaccine injured as core participants, and they were acknowledging that vaccine injury occurred. So for the vaccine injured groups, that was a step in the right direction, but it was still that they were, it was a tragedy, but terribly, terribly rare, extremely rare, kept coming up again and again. And at the same time, the main thrust of everything I listened to was what a wonderful success this rollout of this vaccine programme, what a tribute to British science, everybody who joined in, a huge thanks. Every statement, everybody started off by saying thank you to their wonderful staff for getting this out there. And none of the questioning was in the sort of depth that I would have expected.
No, it certainly wasn't along the lines of, say, a court of law, was it? There was no other side that was able to then cross-examine the witnesses and put points to them in a robust way, yes, and challenge their evidence. That never happened, did it?
No. And I think that was something that came out. As you mentioned the People's Vaccine Inquiry. I think we watched with increasing despair at the module itself. And quite quickly we just thought, we'd already put all our witness statements up on a public website 6 months ago when they decided to defer the hearings from July through to this year. So they were in the public domain. But we decided we must have some sort of press conference in London and invite politicians and the press to come and listen to the voices that had been completely excluded from the whole process. And I think one thing that was very interesting was when you listen to the way they talked to the vaccine injured, they were sort of kind, but in a rather patronising way. And we'd put in a lot of scientific evidence about the potential harms and the actual harms of these products. But so, of course, had the vaccine injured core participant witnesses. Both, I think, Ruth O'Rafferty from the Scottish group and Kate Scott from the Vaccine Injured and Bereaved UK and Charlotte Crichton as well, they'd all put in enormous witness statements with lots of scientific data. So when Ruth O'Rafferty, for example, tried to start talking about the difference between the precise synthetic version that was used for the trials and then the rolled up version, which, and we'll come to this later because there's been a lot of concerns about DNA contamination and all sorts of things, which I'm in another group that's been doing some work on that. And she was immediately shut down by Hugo Keith saying, "Oh no, we can't get into the scientific. That's for the experts." But on day one, he'd said that his commissioned expert had said that the vaccine programme had been extremely successful. So I think the upshot was clearly going to be from the beginning that the vaccines were a tremendous success. He also, I just jotted a few things down, he said, it is of the utmost importance, this is his opening speech, it is of the utmost importance that I emphasise that by the particular metric of the need to protect at a population level against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the vaccine programme succeeded. He ended that it was overwhelmingly successful against a virus that was killing and liable to kill hundreds of thousands of people. So again, it's the exaggeration of risk compared with the exaggeration of the benefit of the vaccines and an underplaying of the safety issues with the vaccines. He said the success of the programme enabled the relaxation of other control measures, facilitating socio-economic recovery. Well, I think you've had a lot of people on this programme before who would have talked about the lack of evidence that lockdowns were going to be of any benefit whatsoever, and the clear damage to the economy, to our mental health, to our children's education. And so we didn't need a vaccine to undo something that should never have been done in the first place. So that was a circular argument. And I think, yes, it was overwhelming. And there were lots of things he said that were clearly incorrect, factually incorrect. But the other thing, I think, apart from the fact they were going to build up for, I think, the vaccine injured, I think the one thing they may get from this is some improvement in the vaccine damage payment scheme, which everybody agrees is not fit for purpose. So that might be something that will come out of it. But it was all on the basis that their injuries were extremely rare, but therefore they needed properly looking after. But the other big emphasis, I think, was about disinformation. The fact that my witness statement, the person they wanted to share it with was the expert witness on vaccine confidence. And I think they're heading for more censorship, really. You know, the fact that we were all censored from even commenting on any questions of the safety of the vaccines. The vaccine injured were shut down as soon as they started to generalise to the overall safety. And the overwhelming discussion was that, what are you doing to make sure these errant voices aren't listened to?
Yeah. Going back to the vaccine injured, it also, for me, it felt they didn't put them into context. So he's put, as you say, pushing the context of tens of thousands of lives saved, which actually has come down from the millions that they kept saying that they were going to save. So tens of thousands. But I was listening to Carl Hennigan actually speaking on GB News recently. He said that actually, when you look at the millions of people that were injected, actually you run into hundreds of thousands that were actually damaged, and or killed. So how they're drawing this benefit from the rollout, I've no idea. And as he said, that because of the way they've hidden the data, or the way they've handled the data, you can't see a benefit or a disbenefit. Actually, it's really difficult to work it out, because none of the continuity of that data seems to be obvious.
Yes, it's interesting because I have neighbours you talk to, and they would say, but even if the vaccine saved one life, surely it's worthwhile. I remember Baroness Hallett said something about masks along those lines. Well, surely if there's any possibility of benefit, why wouldn't you do it? But if you looked at the actual trials, one thing Hugo Keith said that was clearly wrong. He said that there were no serious adverse events reported in the trials. He was trying to say that the adverse events are very rare and therefore you couldn't pick them up in the trials. But he also said, of course, we have a robust and wonderful system for picking these up post-marketing, which we'll, I'm sure, come back to. But actually, what he didn't say was that the trials themselves had 1 in 800 people having a severe, either, hospitalising or even fatal adverse event. There were clearly people in the trials who had major adverse events. But also, when you come to the mortality, what you've just said about lives saved versus lives lost, in the Pfizer trial, they had 2 deaths from COVID or with COVID in the placebo group and 1 in the vaccinated group. So they said, oh great, it's 50% reduction in deaths, so that's good. But what they didn't point out was the overall number of deaths in the vaccinated group was higher than the placebo group. So there were 17 deaths in the vaccinated group and 14 deaths in the placebo group. And the deaths in the placebo group were cardiac deaths. Now, if you're the chief investigator, you have to be told about any patient who dies, but it's then up to you to decide, is this relevant to the vaccine or not? So you can simply say, oh no, that's nothing to do with the vaccine. And so it gets sort of buried. But actually, if you look at the overall benefit, if you're going to say, I think Robert Kennedy, I was hearing him talking also and saying that they took 22,000 people were vaccinated in order to save that one life. So you've got to have something that's very, very safe if you're going to roll this out to the entire population of the world, which is what they were trying to do, in order to save some lives, which you might have been able to do for those who were, who were vulnerable, frail, and at high risk from COVID, it is possible that 1 or 2 doses of these vaccines might have saved some lives from COVID. But even for that group, it might have lost more lives from heart attacks and strokes. Who knows? Because they haven't looked at it properly.
Yeah, and that makes that argument ridiculous to say, well, if it saves one life, it's worth it. Well, but if it takes a life, are you saying that's worth it? You know, one death is one death too many.
Yeah.
So craziness. And the testing itself, looking at some of that data just seems crazy. And apparently this governor in Kansas City is taking Pfizer to court over their testing regime for people over, well, it was between 65 and 84, wasn't it? And then they said that those are over 84, there were only 12 in the trial.
Yes.
So
well, I mean, to come to the other, that's one end of the spectrum. They didn't test this drug on the people who might have been most likely to benefit, which was the people with immunocompromised or who are very elderly, who were the people at highest risk, and they were not included in the trials. But the other group, to come to the other edge of the spectrum, was of course children. So the children's trial on which they decided to roll this out to 12 to 15s had 1,131 children vaccinated, and they were followed for 2 months. I don't think you need to be a medic or an academic to think that doesn't sound enough to be saying it's safe. And yet, Kate Bingham, in the inquiry, she said, well, the vaccine trials were really large. Well, I don't know which trial she was looking at. She was looking at the adult trials. And somebody was pointing out the original polio vaccine, in the 1950s, they had a trial with hundreds of thousands of people in it. And now here we are in 2020s, we think we can only put 20,000 in, and that's big. And then we decide to roll it out to children, and we make the children's trials smaller than the adult trials. Well, if anything, they should have been bigger, because it's even more, unwise to be considering rolling out a vaccine to children if you haven't got really long-term safety data, because they've got their whole life ahead of them. And I think, again, that is one of the aspects, things like fertility, etc. They were saying, it's rubbish, it doesn't cause problems. But if you're a 75-year-old and you're wondering about getting through the next few years from COVID and you think you're going to die, you're not interested in whether it affects fertility. But if you're, anybody who hasn't completed their family, let alone if you're a child, all the potential side effects are going to have far more long-lasting serious harms.
You can find the UK Medical Freedom Alliance in most social media locations, in particular Facebook, on X, YouTube, Spotify, and of course Apple Podcasts, and our favoured location of all, Rumble, which is the home of free speech. You'll also find us in the mainstream media and of course the alternative media too. Remember to like, subscribe and follow at every opportunity, and you'll be notified when our next broadcast is becoming available. But I'm guessing they wouldn't know the impact of a lack of fertility until they reach the age where they start producing or wanted to produce children anyway.
Well, absolutely. I think one of the things just also to touch on is the question about the type of vaccine. And Hugo Keith, in his opening statement, he did give an explanation, which was quite factually correct. And it's amazing how many people, just ordinary members of the public, let alone even half the medical profession, don't seem to have grasped that the mRNA technology and the DNA, the viral vector as well, both AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, they all used a fundamentally different technology from a standard vaccine. So, I'm sure most of the people watching this will have heard this a lot of times. But, if you say took hepatitis B vaccine, you would give somebody 20 micrograms of hepatitis B antigen. So that would be protein from the hepatitis B virus. It might be a killed virus or a inactivated virus or part of a virus that is given, and that's the amount that's given, and you then make antibodies. But these genetic gene-based products, they give you apparently a fixed dose of either DNA in the AstraZeneca's case or RNA in the case of the Moderna and Pfizer. And that's wrapped up in a way, the mRNAs were wrapped in this little lipid nanoparticles in order to help them cross cell membranes. So the whole design, they've modified the RNA in the first place to make it more slowly degraded. They've then wrapped it in a lipid to enable it deliberately to cross into your cells. And once it's in your cells, it then instructs your own genetic mechanism to produce the spike protein. Why go around this complex? Why not just have given spike protein type, like Novavax, Valneva were standard vaccines? So why go for this not modern technology, this new technology that's not got any safety data? And what Hugo Keith didn't seem to grasp. He described it, but he described it like you were saying, oh, isn't it clever? This does it this way and this does it that way. He didn't seem to have any grasp of the fundamental risk of giving a gene-based product. Any new drug, the first thing you have to do is you do a lot of animal studies, which again were missed because this wasn't counted as a new drug. It was counted as an existing type vaccine. So the whole regulatory process, yes, they didn't shortcut the process they chose. They did things in parallel and they pushed through the documentation, but they did everything that was required in the vaccine one because they could put carcinogenesis, does it cause cancers? Not applicable. Does it cause teratogenesis, damage to the fetus? Not applicable. So you look at the application form and it's got all these not applicable. But if they'd been put through as gene products, which both Pfizer and Moderna were assuming they would, and the WHO had draft guidelines drawn up for these special new products, then they would have had to do all the proper animal testing for reproductive harm. And so I think it's unforgivable to use a totally novel technology and then roll it out at speed to the entire population, apart from those who were wise enough to say no thanks. But what it doesn't have in this technology is an off switch. You can have this stuff come into your cells, and they told us it would stay in the arm, which was clearly nonsense. It's designed to go around the body. The lipid nanoparticles are designed to cross cell membranes, so it'll go into every organ in your body. And I'd seen a leaked document from the Pfizer lab in Japan back in 2021 showing animal studies. They only did about 20 rats or something, but they showed that the lipid nanoparticles went into the spleen and the liver and the brain and the heart and the ovaries and the testes. But that was never put out into the public domain until somebody managed to get it on a freedom of information from the Australian TGA, which is their equivalent to our MHRA. And their document came out and it was the same. Because at the time we were worried about publicising it because we didn't know if it was a fraud. It was in Japanese and somebody had translated it. But when I saw the final document, it was identical to the one I got stored on my laptop. So the authorities knew this, but they chose to totally ignore it. So I think this thing about, it's not just where it goes to, it clearly goes everywhere. And the other thing is, how long does it last? Now, in theory, the mRNA should degrade within a few days, but in practice, it clearly isn't doing. And it's been detected in, months on. And I've got colleagues now I've met through all of this with vaccine injuries, and I've got, I was just thinking of one friend who, she's 4 years on, she's still getting flare-ups. She'll have blood tests for her cardiac enzymes and her platelet, clotting factors and so on, and they'll be abnormal. But they always throw in doing a spike protein antibody test. And then they'll come back with their results saying, oh, I'm really sorry, this is still bad and that's still bad. But the good news is you've still got antibodies, so you don't need a booster. And she's saying, but hang on, that's not good news. This is 4 years since I had this drug. Why have I still got antibodies? Now, the answer is highly likely to be because she's still making the spike protein. So in that case, what you're saying is that this poor woman, I don't think most people, I think for most of us, you probably turn it off within a few weeks, but we don't know. It's absolutely basic fundamental data. So for some people, including this friend of mine, it's like she's had a vaccination every day for 4 years. Now, most vaccines, I had a smallpox vaccine as a baby. It was a one-off, and I haven't, it's given me lifelong protection. Most vaccines, you might get 2 doses and maybe a booster every 10 years. this COVID one is pretty rubbish because they're recommending if you're vulnerable you should have a booster every 6 months. But nobody's saying it's a good idea to be vaccinated every day. And that is in effect what is happening to these people who have failed to break down the mRNA, or it's integrated somehow into their own DNA mechanism. We don't know why, but they are still continuing to churn out antibodies years later.
Yeah, well, I interviewed a guy yesterday actually, which will be released soon, who said exactly the same thing. He's still got spike protein in his system, and this has been, as you say, for 3-4 years now. He's very, very unwell, extremely unwell. He's still not sure whether he's going to survive this, and so his body has had such a major reaction, and it keeps perpetuating. It's. So he thinks he's going to have a good day, a few good days, and then all of a sudden, he's taken to his bed again because he's getting the symptoms reoccurring. And of course they can't. And of course they can't explain it apparently, but the tests show that he has still got spike protein in his system after all this time.
Yeah.
And they couldn't have known that because it's not been around long enough. So it feels like it's always going to be experimental.
Yeah.
When does it stop being experimental?
And I think that's one of the problems. One of the other problems from the trials was that, okay, they're not big enough to look for very rare side effects, but they're good enough to looking for most side effects if they'd done the trials properly. But even that, normally you're meant to keep your two, you have your vaccine or drug treatment group and your placebo, and it's double blind, so nobody knows which is which, and you then follow them up for a minimum of 2 years. In this case, there were some guidelines from the international regulatory group, to which the MHRA is a signatory, saying that for people who are highly vulnerable, it might be necessary to break the code after a year. Please try and keep going for a year as a minimum. But, if you were young and healthy and you'd gone into a trial, there was no reason to break the code early, but they did. So if you look in the Pfizer trial, and it was Pfizer themselves who asked for this, they who I don't think are really renowned for their ethics, said, it wouldn't be ethical to deny people this vaccine once we've shown it's effective. Well, I think it's not ethical to give them a vaccine until we've shown it's safe. But they didn't seem to be bothered about the safety side of it. And so mostly, most of the first 2-month data was published. By the time they published the 6-month follow-up, because they got the approval after 2 months follow-up, but when they published the 6-month follow-up, it actually only had about 4 months, because by then nearly everybody in the control group had been offered and had chosen to receive the vaccine. And when it comes to children, I was saying, well, look, we shouldn't even be trying this out until we've got the long-term safety data on adults. But of course, I think I was waiting for a 2-year follow-up. But again, the 2-year follow-up, when it came, had no more information than was in that 6-month one. Because up to 4 months, that was the end of the randomised trial. And that, to my mind, is really recklessly negligent.
Please sign up to receive our newsletter and you'll be notified of UK MFA campaigns, open letters, calls to action and any important updates. You can do this on our website at ukmedfreedom.org. That's ukmedfreedom.org. And all these things that you're saying, you see, this is what frustrated me about this inquiry, because none of it came out, not in that way. And it was almost like deliberately skirted around, and it's the great phrase now is gaslighting, isn't it? But I mean, they that seemed to be the ultimate in gaslighting, basically.
Yeah.
And I got very frustrated early on, and I stopped watching, to be honest with you, because I got too angry. I lost my mum in 2020, in May of 2020, in a care home. Couldn't visit her, and I'm just one of thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have gone through sort of similar issues, and I just become very angry about these measures that were taken, the interventions. And you just want them to be at least acknowledged and dealt with, and they haven't done that. So I personally don't have a great hopes of what might come out of this inquiry at all. And that is a shame, and especially if there's something else obviously we've spoken about in the past, though, is the pregnant women. And the fact that they were being jabbed, and now they're still offering the jab to pregnant women of any stage of their pregnancy, no matter what trimester they're in.
No, and I mean, it's interesting because, again, Pfizer, you shouldn't be doing any trials in pregnancy in the first instance. That's always been a no-no, like children. But there are situations when you would, for children, for example, because I've done quite a lot of clinical research, you can only do trials in children if it's for a disease that only affects children, and you couldn't do it in the adults. So, for example, I was a newborn intensivist, so a baby with premature baby with respiratory distress syndrome. You were allowed to do trials for treating that, but that's very different from rolling something out, in the way that we have for the vaccine. And I think the other thing, the same applies to pregnancy. You wouldn't normally do that unless you were testing a drug for treating preeclampsia or a condition of pregnancy. But again, it would be a drug you'd probably tested for a lot of other indications in healthy adults already. You might have treated people with other forms of high blood pressure first before you think about giving it to a pregnant woman with blood pressure problems. And you'd have done a lot of animal studies first too, which they clearly didn't. And so all of that, but Pfizer were asked to, and Pfizer, if you look in the information leaflet that comes in not that most people see it, but if you were shown it, it says that they've not been tested, they can't advise it in pregnancy, it's not been tested. But they were then asked to do a study, and they got 4,000, there was great, announcement of this in February 21, I think, that they'd announced they were going to set up this study with 4,000 women who were going to be randomised, pregnant women who were going to be randomised to have this. And then they just didn't report it, and eventually it's come out now. I think the 6-month follow-up or something, or maybe 1 year follow-up, has just been published quite quietly, and they got 400 patients in the end, and I think about 178 were vaccinated and another 178 controls, and they were excluded from the first trimester, so that's not really helpful because, it is helpful, but it doesn't tell you that it's safe. And a lot of the midwives who are concerned, of course, were seeing people who'd actually been vaccinated prior to the pregnancy, but they just, anecdotally are seeing a lot more mid-trimester and early miscarriages and mid-trimester miscarriages. In Scotland they had those episodes when they had an increase in neonatal deaths and stillbirths. And they absolutely came in with the spike of the vaccine rollout in pregnancy, and 6 months later they had another cluster when they were just rolling out boosters to people in pregnancy. But they actually had an independent inquiry, and I wrote, along with many others, to the chair of the inquiry, and she wrote back a very pleasant letter, but said, but we're keeping an open mind. But they specifically said they were not going to look at the vaccine status of the women whose babies had died, because they said it might increase vaccine hesitancy, and also they couldn't think of a mechanism whereby it might cause harm anyway, so what was the point of looking? Well, to my mind, there were 24 deaths or something, so it wouldn't have been difficult. The first thing you'd do if I were in charge of an inquiry is to do a detailed notes review on all the 24 cases and see if you could see any common themes that were running through to connect why these babies had died. But the idea of saying you wouldn't look because of vaccine hesitancy, well, if you'd looked and you'd found that none of them were vaccinated, it could have done a real boost for vaccine confidence, because you'd have said, actually, folks, we've looked, and out of these 24 babies, 8 mums have been vaccinated, 16 hadn't, and 30% of this population have been vaccinated, so it's exactly what we, would have expected. But if you looked and you found that actually 22 of them have been vaccinated, you'd be thinking, oh, crikey. And then also, they said there was no mechanism. Well, given, for example, with AstraZeneca, we were seeing all the clotting problems. With Pfizer, we're seeing inflammation in blood vessels, myocarditis. We know that the mRNA crosses the placenta. So why would it not affect the placental blood vessels themselves? Why would it not cause problems in the developing fetus? It's such a closed mind, and I think that's been one of the things I found so depressing. The loss of critical thinking amongst the medical profession has been quite staggering.
I was just going to say that because you would think that just on a personal basis, just out of sheer intrigue, you would think, what is going on here? There must be something that we should be looking at. So it's almost that it's one of my favourite subjects at the moment is that we seem to be doing medicine by rote or by AI or by that this narrative comes down and you say that this is how you do medicine now. You only look at a specific symptom, and when you've been through all the computer screens, there'll be a pharmaceutical kicked out at the end that you can give your patient. That's what it feels like at the moment. That's what I've experienced myself, to be honest with you, with my GP. And a consultant. So it's similar thing. There's always a pharmaceutical at the end of it that is the answer to your problem. There's never something else, or they won't look into the history of the family or look into your personal history. What even your previous medical records don't seem to matter anymore. It's you've got a symptom. Oh, we've got a pill for that. Off you go.
Yeah.
And that I find very, very sad. And I which kind of brings me on to what sort of doctors we're actually producing now.
It's interesting because I'm in a group called the Doctors for Patients UK, which was set up for working doctors, but they allowed a few old fogies in. But I think it's interesting because talking to the younger members of the group, they are very clear that their critical thinking, was not encouraged. Questioning wasn't really encouraged. I think they when they're talking to we've got a whole age range in this group from pre-registration, F1 trainees through to retired. And the younger they are, the more they seem to say it's been hard, very hard, because they want to think about it and they want to go and ask, and they're not really encouraged to do so. Which is sad, because actually I would say when I first was training, there were some of the older consultants in my medical school, the old school, and you were, oh my goodness, I don't not ask that, and you get rapped over the knuckles for impertinence if you asked a question. But that was dying out, and most of my working, all the younger consultants that were training me as a student, and through my training years as a junior doctor, etc., I think we very much did get, we had journal clubs, you had clinico-pathological conferences, all sorts of things where the whole aim was to pull things apart and tease out, could you have done things differently, etc. And I think there's been a great loss of that.
The overall ethical approach to medicine, I suppose, that's what feels like has been eroded.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, as we were talking about the children and the vaccine rollout, because one of the things that was really pushed was this rollout to everybody. Now, I've sent you some slides. I think one of the things I've put in is just the death rate by age. It's ludicrous to think that a one-size-fits-all programme would be right. You are 19,000 times more likely to die with a label of COVID if you were over 85 than if you were under 15. And at the beginning, and in fact, Kate Bingham, the vaccine czar, and Matt Hancock, they said this is for adults. She went further and said it's for over 50s and those with health vulnerabilities. And at the inquiry, Professor Lim, who was the lead for the vaccine and the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisations, he was saying that if they'd followed that, the original schedule was coming down the ages and the people with health vulnerabilities, and it was never going to go to the healthy under 50s, and that would have accounted for 99% of the deaths in the first year. But nobody, again, when he was saying they didn't really push any questions, they never said, but why did you decide to go on down the ages after that? And for me, I wrote, the thing that made me really wake up to this was in February 21, when I saw AstraZeneca, Oxford University was advertising on the early evening news for children to join the AstraZeneca trial. And I wrote straight off to Andrew Pollard, who's the Professor of Paediatrics in Oxford, who was head of the trial and is the chairman of the JCVI, though he did point out he'd recused himself from that and put this other guy in charge. Professor Lim was in charge instead. But he wrote back within 2 hours, within about 10 minutes. I got a reply at 11 o'clock at night saying, "Oh, hi, Ros, you're quite right. We don't know about safety in children, and that's why we're doing the study." And anyway, Pfizer and Moderna are doing children's studies. So, if they did it, that made it all right for us to do. But of course, what I didn't know at the time I'd written to him was that already there'd been a death of a 32-year-old, Stephen Wright, who's the guy who was a psychologist going to work at Great Ormond Street, wanted to get this because he thought he'd be looking at vulnerable children in hospital and that it would prevent infection and transmission, which again it's clear it never did and it never was going to. And he died, and a yellow card had gone to the MHRA. But what do they do with it? They just ignore it. So we started a children's trial after the first death of a healthy young adult from this drug. When Denmark had their first death, because they obviously got the vaccine later than us, it was a British product and we were ahead and this was so wonderful, we were the front of the queue, we were the world leaders to get the first vaccines out. But when Denmark had their first death in March, Holland had a death one day, Denmark had a death the next day, Denmark suspended AstraZeneca just like that. And within the next 3 days, I think 10 countries in Europe and one in the Far East had suspended it. But here, they were still saying, no, it's fine. We've done 10 million doses, we've had 10 deaths. Well, it turned out to be more like 50 deaths. And of course, if you looked at the age range, they were young, healthy people who were dying, not the people that the vaccine was really, might have had the potential to benefit. And the younger you go, the more ludicrous it becomes. So that was my first sort of move into all this. But again, nobody in the inquiry said, but really pushed this. It's this juggernaut. And when you looked at the JCVI and when they were asked to approve it for children, it was quite interesting because they were quite reluctant, I think. I mean, I've read all the minutes of their meetings and they said they deliberated for about 6 weeks after it first got authorised by the MHRA. They kept deliberating and then they said they were not going to recommend it for healthy under 18s because the risk benefit was too close to call. The benefits were small because the children weren't affected by COVID, and moreover the potential side effects were real, and there were also unknown side effects at that stage because it was too early, and they wouldn't recommend it. Well, 48 hours later, there's minutes that they were asked to call an emergency meeting by the chief medical officer to reconsider in quotes, their decision. In other words, you've given the wrong answer, guys. You need to, do this again. But, again, nobody picked Chris Whitty up on that. Nobody could pick anybody up. And, that was the sort of questions I'd listed at the bottom of my witness statement that needed to be answered. And though they then had another look and said, oh, well, let's give it to healthy 16 and 17-year-olds, but we still won't recommend it for under 16s. And then they had a conference call with cardiologists in the States and in Israel. Well, I had conference calls with the same two groups who were extremely helpful and gave me the same data that they'd given to the JCVI. And you could see from the minutes of those meetings, they were obviously quite split across the group. There were people saying we need more time. Because the US and Israel had started the rollout to children earlier, they were seeing the myocarditis, the heart inflammation that we didn't yet know about. And so they were saying, can we wait for 6 months to see what happens to these kids? Well, again, I've given you a slide about the myocarditis. They keep saying it's rare and it gets better quickly. Well, how rare depends on how hard you look for something. So in the States, on their random, VAERS reporting system, a bit like our yellow cards, you're lucky if you get 10%, you might get less of the actual events reported. But in that, they came up with 1 in 9,000 for the sort of adolescent boys. They seem to be the group at highest risk. So adolescent boys, 1 in 9,000. Israel had spotted this cluster of cases, so they then notified all paediatricians, cardiologists, emergency physicians, and they had 1 in 6,000. And Hong Kong went a step further, and they decided to notify parents. Actually, at the time of the vaccine, were given an information leaflet describing the symptoms and said, if your child gets any of these symptoms, make sure you go and get them checked out. And they had a 1 in 3,000. But Thailand did what we obviously should have been doing here, what the MHRA should have demanded of Pfizer. They did a proper prospective study. They had 2 big secondary schools, and all the children coming in for their second dose of Pfizer had to fill out a diary card for 10 days, and they had blood tests and a cardiograph done before the first dose and a week later. And they found, really worrying, they found 1 in 29 of these children had evidence of either subclinical or clinical cardiac involvement, myocarditis or pericarditis.
That's huge, isn't it?
Which is
huge.
And the group in the States, they had a group of children who'd been, when you come to how mild is it, they'd had children who'd been admitted with chest pain after their vaccination. Within a day or two, they got chest pain and palpitations. But they did get better quickly, so after a few days they seemed to be fine. But because it was a new condition, they thought, well, we'd better do investigations. So they gave all these kids a cardiac MRI scan, and 90%, 89% of the children who come in with some symptoms but had now got better still had abnormalities on those scans that were suggestive of cardiac scars. And they then followed them for 6 months, and this is the data that the JCVI wanted when they said, can we wait for 6 months? They followed them up. They've taken 3 years to publish it, but they have found that 60% of those kids still had scarring on their cardiac MRI scans 6 months after their vaccination. Now, we've no idea what that means for the future, but the type of changes they found are the sort which have been in ordinary post-viral myocarditis been seen to be the best predictor for late deaths. The 5-year survival being probably about 20% of people with viral myocarditis who recover initially will die over the next 5 years.
I mean, I'm no medic, but even I understand that any heart damage tends to be lifelong, that it doesn't, as I understand it, doesn't repair.
Yeah, so, well, I think some of it may do, but a lot of it may not. But nobody seems to want to look. And I think that is the really devastating bit of the whole thing. It's this totally blinkered, safe and effective mantra that just gets repeated. I think, that it was interesting because one of the people who came to our People's Vaccine Inquiry, when, as I say, we held this conference a few days later, and Caroline Pover, who's the chair of trustees of the UK CV family, which is the biggest, I think, and they're a registered charity now, so they're a support network for the vaccine injured. And she said in her talk at the beginning, she said one of the troubles was managing expectation, that people thought this would be some sort of a proper detailed inquiry, and it wasn't really at all. So it was about managing expectation. But she said in her daily life now, conversations she couldn't have had 3 or 4 years ago when she first was talking about her vaccine injuries, people were cold shouldering her. They were not wanting to know. And I heard her speak in Bath about 3 years ago, and it was awful because she said they were battered from both sides, because if they spoke out, the vaccine zealots and half the population would say, well, I've been fine, it's ridiculous, it's probably nothing to do with your vaccine, it's just coincidence. And then on the other hand, those of us who were trying to say, hang on, these vaccines are not very safe, you'd see it I'd see it on Twitter, horrible comments saying, well, you sheeple, you idiot, why did you take it? And I think this is, so awful. I used to put replies to those saying, how dare you, The only thing I think the government made a success of, if success is the right word, was the fear propaganda. They were extremely efficient at it. And there are people who are still afraid. And when you're afraid, you don't think straight. I think we all know that. You go into paralysis mode if you haven't managed to run away quickly first. And so I think she said now, though, she's going out, she's got her books on her, runs a market store, she's got the book she's been writing, and she said everybody who picks up the book, they'll say, oh my goodness, and I've got a friend who's this, or my cousin that, or, everybody's got a story about somebody they know with a vaccine injury. But when she went into the inquiry, she said for that 3 weeks, it felt she was like in an alternative universe. All these people, in the opening of the previous module, they actually were saying that they wanted people to wear masks to attend the hearings, Well, in the end, I think they got such a backlash from that, they dropped it. But this was 2 years after we'd stopped wearing masks in public. So the idea that that this investigation would require you to wear a mask, which just shows where they're coming from, really. And it was all, well, everything we did, we should have done it sooner and harder and faster. No question of whether actually a lot of what we did was extremely unwise and has caused, I think, permanent, seriously long-lasting damage to our mental health, our physical health, our economy, our children's education, all been damaged in a way that's going to have long-term effects, I think.
So can we put this right? Is there things that we can do now to turn this massive tank around the other way?
Right. Well, that's a real challenge. I mean, I think one thing, I know people, I've got friends who think, why is she still banging on about it? COVID's over and gone. They've kind of forgotten about it. But I think one thing we have to do is get this mRNA technology off the books, because it is fundamentally different, and I think it's fundamentally an unsafe technology. So they've just rolled it out for a new baby vaccine trial for RSV, respiratory virus, and they've had to suspend the trial after 6 months because the children who'd received the vaccine were getting more severe bronchiolitis than the ones who hadn't. But they're rolling it out for flu vaccine, and it's all coming. I think the vaccine industry, most of the vaccines are off patent now, so they need something new and snazzy to market all over again. And this pandemic was an absolute golden opportunity, you might think, for an industry that was struggling to say, actually, we can make a profit again, we can sell something new to the unsuspecting British public. But to do that successfully from a business model point of view, they first had to scare us witless, scare us sufficiently that the public were demanding lockdowns almost before Boris announced it, because they'd had so much death and destruction put on their televisions, which again, we know a lot of that was fake. But I remember seeing something from India where they were showing somebody collapsing in the street, and then somebody showed it was a picture from where there'd been some awful gas leak from a factory 4 years earlier, and there was the same woman in the same clothes keeling over on a bench, and the same woman in other similar clothes coming up to see if she was all right, and they put this out as being a COVID death. So there was lots of that going.
Yeah. Well, there was a it makes me laugh. You have to laugh really because it's so ridiculous. But there was one where there was all these body bags, and then at the end of the video, when supposedly they'd cut, one of them started moving and actually opened it and lit a cigarette. So he obviously hadn't died of anything particularly serious. Yeah.
Well, I think we had a thing here where quite early on they obviously decided the public weren't frightened enough, and it was in the Sage minutes of the Spivey group that they needed to be more. People needed to be more fearful. The young, particularly, were still going out and what have you, meeting their friends. And then you saw all these young people in hospital with oxygen masks on, breathing deeply and saying, I didn't think And later on, when it came to the vaccine rollout, they were so regretting they hadn't had a vaccine. And somebody did one of these facial ID things and so worked out that at least 5 of these 6 people were out-of-work actors. And you think, seems a very high-risk job being an out-of-work actor. But so laughing aside, I think there are things we can do. I think there is a change. We keep thinking that, but I think more of the public are just thinking this is ridiculous. I was talking to friends at the pub the other night, and they were just saying, but we wouldn't fall for this again, would we? They'd both been vaccinated, but they were wishing they hadn't been, and really, again, had no understanding about the mRNA technology. But I think a lot of people are just saying no. There's this movement I mentioned, I'm part of this group called North Group, which was started by the Scandinavians and then rapidly joined by the Baltic countries and then the UK. And there are groups like Heart Group in the UK. There are these groups of scientists in every country in the world who've been shouting. So we all think we're just a lone voice here and we can't make any headway with our politicians. But by doing it all, the idea was that we would 10 countries all send their letters to their head of, their Prime Minister on the same day. And since then, we've had another 4 countries the following week, another 8. We're now got 22 countries involved. It was all based on what's happening in Australia. So they've got several really on-the-ball senators and congressmen there. And Russell Broadbent particularly has been leading this. And they've particularly, what this group have focused on, because the group in Sweden were research scientists, and they've been looking at the DNA contamination that's occurred in a lot of these RNA vaccines. And it's now been tested in labs all across the world, really. But still not by the official, there's no official recognition. And that's what they're focusing on. But they're seeing all the harms from these, and the main call is to suspend completely all mRNA technology vaccines, and I think that has to be the first aim. I think the other thing, of course, is the wind of change across the pond. And I can't say I'm a Trump fan. I've always found him a rather unpleasant man, but. When I thought that Robert Kennedy was going to join his team, I suddenly had a surge of optimism. If he does even half of what he said he'll do, if he can stop the mandating of vaccines, and you can see already there's 12 states in the US have now written to Congress about, this late pardon of Anthony Fauci, the day Biden was stepping down. Suddenly he gives an unconditional pardon to anything, no crime. He's not meant to have committed a crime, I didn't think, but obviously they must think he has, because why would you pardon him otherwise? But there's 12, I think, or no more, 16, I think, states, their attorney generals writing to Congress to say, look, if you've got any information that you want us to take forward through legal challenges at state level, because of the federal system, there may be a federal pardon, but it doesn't apply to the individual states. So I think he and quite a lot of his cronies might find themselves on the wrong side of the law. And I think so he'll stop the mandates, I'm sure. And I think the other thing he will clearly do is to open up the data. Because again, all of this research is done with public money. It's our taxpayers' money, and yet we're not allowed to see the raw results. And that used to be standard practice. And it's just not anymore. It's just gone. You can't. You don't share your data. You only share your nice little tabulated final results. And then the other thing, which I'm sure he will do, and I hope we do here, is to stop the indemnity, because it was through the PrEP Act, I think back in the 1980s, that they said that the pharmaceutical industry wouldn't have to pay for any damage. It would all be paid for by the taxpayer. And that's what's happening here, this vaccine damage payment scheme we were talking about. It's a terrible scheme, because you have to be more than 60% disabled to be eligible. So there was a guy who'd had a leg amputated because he'd had a clot in his artery to his leg. But they said, he wasn't sufficiently, you've only lost one limb, so why do you think you're eligible? And then also the maximum is 120,000, which if you've had a massive stroke and you haven't died, or you've died and you're a young wage earner, that's nowhere near. But if the drug companies, if you bought a new car and the brakes fail, the manufacturer will be liable. Everything else the manufacturer is liable if it's their negligence. And they've just got this complete, let-out clause. And I think that's the thing that's got to stop, would be the most obvious thing to do. And that doesn't require a lot of legislation. It would be a very easy thing to do quite quickly. And I think it would sharpen their minds enormously on testing properly for safety. And AstraZeneca, their chief exec, actually said right back at the beginning, you can't expect us to roll this out without indemnity, because we've no idea whether there'll be serious side effects 5 years down the road, which was a bit prophetic of him. And of course, again, the way AstraZeneca just disappeared, I have friends who got AstraZeneca for their initial vaccine, and when they went for their autumn booster, there was only Pfizer, and they said, I'm afraid we haven't got any AstraZeneca today. It just, and only now they've suddenly said, actually, they then withdrew it and said it was on commercial grounds. But I've heard that this same Professor Pollard from Oxford, I was in a meeting quite recently, and he said that because of the clotting problems, it was not safe enough for a routine vaccine, which was, it was. So I think it'll come. I think there's going to be a big backlash across a lot of countries. I think Australia, I think the countries that have the worst mandates are probably the ones that are going to kick over the soonest. A lot of the Eastern European countries too, who I think have lived under totalitarian regimes in the past, have been a bit more awake to the huge dangers of this central control of everything. The Americans are going to withdraw from the WHO, possibly. And I think, again, I used to think they were a wonderful organisation. But if they'd stuck to what they were good at, which was trying to get clean water everywhere and, decent separation of sewage from drinking water, but instead they got on to this vaccinate the world, and we're not, the reason you and I don't get cholera and typhus and things and typhoid isn't because of vaccines, it's because we've just got clean water and we're not rat infested, and so actually producing a vaccine to prevent a disease that should be prevented by proper infrastructure is just the only benefit for that is the pharmaceutical industry's coffers, as far as I can see.
And it does seem that they've actually done very well out of it so far. And I don't want to jump down conspiracy theories and rabbit holes, but when you occasionally I do, and it actually becomes quite obvious when you follow the money and see how well they've been doing, and you just wonder, was it always a money-making exercise? I don't know.
Well, lockdowns, it's interesting because the British rep on the WHO, Navarro, he said quite early on that the only thing lockdowns would do would be to increase poverty, and we know that poverty is bad for health. And if you look internationally, the gap between the rich and the poor countries has widened, and if you look nationally, the gap between the rich and the poor in the UK has widened. Some of the big companies that were doing all online sales and so on did very well out of it all. But, the cost of living crisis for the people who are on a fixed low income has been pretty disastrous.
Yeah. But if you live in fear, because the government is telling you you've got something to be very fearful of, again, your health is going to deteriorate anyway, isn't it? We're far healthier when we're happy and free and able to get on and lead a fulfilling life. And if you're just cocooned at home and told you can't go out, can't visit your family, can't visit your friends, well, depression sets in and you're going to get sick, aren't you?
Yes. Well, I think you were talking earlier on about your mother dying in that first year and not being able to visit. And, I think if you look at the Scottish inquiry, I think they're being a lot more honest than the UK inquiry. And they've had some heartrending stuff about the care of the elderly. I think if I hadn't been a paediatrician, that would have been the thing I'd have been lobbying on, because it did feel quite awful. My sister was in a similar position. Her husband died. He hadn't hugged his daughter in 6 months prior to his death. He didn't die of COVID, but, he's not able to just do ordinary things. And I suppose as a paediatrician it was much easier not to be frightened, because I'd spent my entire working career in infectious disease. The biggest cause of admissions in children's wards are infections of all sorts. And, if you went in and a child had meningococcal septicemia, you didn't say, I can't, put a tube into this child until I've got my hazmat suit on. You just got on with it. And the parents didn't stand outside the door. They were in holding their child's hand. And yet I know somebody whose 8-year-old got COVID, and they put this child in his bedroom for 10 days. And they took his meals up. I mean, this is child abuse by any stretch of the imagination. They took his meals up and held a tennis racket so they could hold it at arm's length, knocked the door, and then he reached out and reached his meal off the tennis racket and went back in and shut the door and ate on his own. And he was 8. I mean, that is what we allowed the government fear propaganda to do to ourselves, to do to us. It's just quite extraordinary. And I think most people weren't that frightened, and those who were a bit frightened quite quickly realised that actually they didn't need to be so frightened. But there was a small pocket of people you see now still out wearing masks, even now. And they presumably, if they're still wearing masks now, they're presumably going to go on doing that for the rest of their lives. And some of them are quite young, and you think it's very, very sad, because prior to this, I don't ever remember seeing people in, London wearing masks.
Maybe the occasional visitors from China or somewhere, maybe.
And I think if you look, the Chinese wear a lot of masks, but it was never for infection, it was for air pollution. I think you would find a lot, if you're in a big city like Beijing and Shanghai and things, there's a lot of particulates. And a mask might be helpful for those, but they're never going to be helpful for these tiny airborne viruses. And you see people, their glasses are steaming up, and you can see the air coming out the top and down the sides.
Or they're struggling along the road, and the mask is sucking on their face as they're breathing, so it's making it even more difficult for them to walk because they're already struggling. And no, I know. And was it cigarette backs? He said it was like trying to stop a mosquito with a chain link fence. It's never going to work. So
I think what we have to do, when you say what do we have to do, I think we have to just be more open. I think I spent a lot of time doing a lot of work, but in my personal life I was not saying that much, because but I think I'm being braver to just talk to people at random now and get into conversations. And I think then you suddenly realise, I suddenly realised that somebody up the road has got a copy of the book of the Deck of Science and said, I came across you'd written a chapter. But I never would have had that conversation with her otherwise. And I think there's a lot more people out there than you know about who have been very worried about all of this. But I think the medical profession have been fairly cowardly, because, you look at the uptake of the vaccines in the NHS now, they're still meant to be getting their boosters, but it's about 20% or so. And yet they're still recommending boosters for other people, and that feels a bit unethical.
And it's what this organisation's all about, isn't it? It's medical ethics, and that is it's one thing that does seem to have been really terribly eroded. And if we could get that back and get doctors thinking about their ethical stance again as well.
Yes, and actually that reminds me, I've got one last slide if you want to put up at the end, which is that we know this doesn't prevent transmission, but even if it did, it is not appropriate for children to be given something to protect adults. That's the law, is that it has to be for their own benefit, and JCVI were initially quite clear about that. But even now, healthy 12 to 64 year olds, so 12 to 15s are in with the adults, are eligible for vaccination if they live with somebody who's immunocompromised. And the picture that you'll see is a 3-generation picture, only the middle generation's missing. It's a little girl sitting on her granny's lap, and it's an NHS advertisement for a child, primary school age child, to be vaccinated to protect your vulnerable loved ones. And you think about this mum stuck in the middle. She's got her elderly mother, who she thinks is perhaps a bit vulnerable, and perhaps she should protect her. And then she's got this little girl that she's thinking, do I really want to give this child something that I don't know about the safety of, and could potentially harm her? Well, as a grandparent, I've had my 70, my 3 years and 10. I've got no entitlement to have longer at other people's expense. And the idea that I would want any of my grandchildren to have put themselves at risk of, say, myocarditis or something, to try and protect me, even if it would have worked. And of course, as we know, this vaccine doesn't prevent infection and transmission. And we all know lots of people who are getting COVID again and again, despite having had multiple doses of vaccine. So it is one of the most ineffective vaccines in the history, and it's also one of the most hazardous as well. And I think, that's what we have to bear in mind, and we just have to get rid of these mRNA vaccines and try and get back to critical thinking and a social existence where friends and meeting real people and less time on your tablet is probably the order of the day.
I think so. Here. Well, that sounds like a brilliant place to finish, actually. Unless you've got anything else you'd like to tag on, but
I think that's.
I think those last few words actually should echo everywhere. That's really important. I'm really grateful, Ros. So grateful, and I look forward to seeing you again. And stunning.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good luck with the ongoing programmes, because they're all very good.
Well, Well, we're doing our best, and it's just another way to outreach, I think,
Yeah.
and get people on that, like yourself, who are experts in their field and really know their stuff. That's the important thing, because there is a lot of misinformation out there, I think, one way or another on both sides, and it's really important that we stay grounded and deal with the truth.
Okay,
So
thank you.
anyway, thank you so much. See you
Thank you.
soon. Please consider donating to the UKMFA. We are really grateful for all donations, no matter how small. Your donations enable us to continue to lobby for your right to informed consent and medical freedom to be upheld, and to provide resources to educate and empower the public. There are multiple options for donating. One is that you can scan the QR code that's on this video right now, or you can go to the link that is featured in the description below this video, or you can go onto our website and contribute via donor box, or you can buy us a coffee.